Ladies and gentlemen, please welcome to the stage former County Commissioner for Miami-Dade County, Katie Sorensen. And joining her, one of Florida's most notable Republicans, Floridian and nationally, Mr. Al Cardenas.
Good evening. Good evening, Al. I believe them. Their testimonies resonated with sincerity and pain. As we each have our own story and our own truth, they've told theirs. It's a strange era. In this era, that alone is refreshing and inspiring. Many statements stood out. My family faced persecution for religious and political beliefs. People also face persecution for their color, ethnicity, gender, and sexual identity. How much immigrants love America. My Latvian immigrant in-laws escaped both Russians and Nazis and came to the US in 1949. On the combined salaries of a brewery worker in Milwaukee and a housekeeper, they paid taxes and put 3 sons through college and 2 of them through medical school. They loved America and they contributed. My parents never discussed race. My parents and their friends discussed race, and I was taken to civil rights demonstrations beginning when I was 10 years old. I was taught that there was injustice in our country, and it had to change. I didn't experience racism until I went to the University of Florida. Sadly ironic that an institution of higher learning, which provides a liberal arts education, would be the source of prejudice and discrimination. You're in the South now. Blacks don't sit in front. The rabbi called this a splash of ice water and raw racism. What about women who aren't allowed to worship in the same sections of synagogues as men? History tells us separate is inherently unequal. Sexism is raw too. The bartender threw our glasses on the floor and broke them. It doesn't matter where you're from. The pain is the same. But then he said, I would not accept it. I've learned that's how to lessen the pain, by refusing to accept it. This country gives us a chance to stand up for our rights. But as we know, people die or lose their legs for standing up for their rights. It's always a danger, especially in our violent society. Standing up takes courage. If you don't know anyone who's been on food stamps or you don't know any black people or white people, you need to enlarge your circle. Diversity and inclusion. We have opportunities every day. I needed to get an education. We need to be educated in quality public schools from pre-K through college at no or low cost. America should be investing in all of us, not only because it's the right thing to do, but because the investment also pays off. I joined the Army when I was 18. We couldn't say why we're willing to fight for America beyond the idea of freedom. If we send young people to war, let's be clear about why. The costs, the stakes, the impacts, and the goals. The mere idea of freedom is not enough to justify the torture, rape, and killing. I believe in free speech, but swastikas and sticks and threats to burn down synagogues is where my nose begins. Freedom of speech has its limits. All freedoms do. Others' rights are valid. Freedom of religion doesn't justify discrimination against LGBTQ people. The right to bear arms shouldn't include military weapons used for mass murder. What worries me is not just who's in power. What worries me is who's in power. A president who has disdain for our Constitution, our values, and our norms. A Congress that looks the other way to accommodate him, gambling that if they play along, they'll get what they want. A judiciary that's moving to the right, threatening women's self-determination and bodily integrity, among many other issues. Are our institutions strong enough so that democracy will survive? Our nation is young, and our test is in progress. I hope we pass. Dictators, right or left wing, suppress free expression because what they're most afraid of is the truth. More insidious, and perhaps more effective, is calling free expression and factual information fake news, confusing people with lies, repeating lies over and over again so that people eventually believe them, attacking and undermining our democratic institutions as the press and our law enforcement agencies to delegitimize them in the eyes of the people. Democracy isn't just about ideals. Life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness means something different today than they did 200 years ago. Yes, now they don't only apply to property-owning white men. They apply to the rest of us, too. A lot of young people don't understand how much we could lose if we don't get involved. It's not only the young. Apathy is rampant. Local elections get barely 20% turnout. How can women not vote? Susan B. Anthony dedicated her life to securing women's suffrage and died before it became the law of the land. There's a lot to lose and much to gain if we organize and mobilize. We can create the society we want. Our democracy is in danger. I agree. We've got work to do. Yes, we do. Al?
Thank you, Katie. Good evening. Yeah, I was very encouraged by the beginning of this program and the words being made, because we weren't talking about wages, we weren't talking about the stock markets. We were expressing our concerns about the quality of our hearts in America today. They say now that the human race started about 180,000 years ago. And at the same time, we witnessed this week the ingenuity of man and women and the human race. When Elon Musk sent that rocket to the sky and had these fuel tanks come back and I don't know if any of you saw it, but land on this 10-foot radius after traveling thousands of miles. That's the ingenuity of the human race. Tonight, there'll be a child born at Miami-Jackson Hospital who lived to be 130 years of age. Our ability to advance in healing the human race is notable. Science has made incredible strides in this 180,000 years. That's our brain. And then I asked myself, okay, well, we also have a heart, and many of us think we also have a soul. How could our brain have progressed so far and our heart hasn't? It's probably the most remarkable question I ask myself every day, why the human race has made so much progress in these areas and perhaps so little. I have a special needs grandson who's taught me a lot about the heart. He's now 15. It's the purest, most loving heart I know. And you ask yourself, why can't we share more of that? Look, I'm not discouraged. Our country's only 200 some years old. For 180,000 years, no one talked about a democracy until over 200 years ago. That's in my new school period of time. But my concern and your concern is where are we today and where we're going? Because I'm a firm believer that in a democracy, politicians are a reflection of society. And so if you want to help the political process and help it be what it should be in representing all of its citizens, you have to cure the hearts of society. We have to get better. You know, America was born with a defect, and that defect was slavery. And I think you've heard here today how imperfect a nation we've been, and at the same time we've been the best experiment of mankind to date. I think what gets us all here, sitting here, is a perplexity of why we're not now advancing. It seems like we're taking steps back in terms of racism, steps back in terms of our feelings for each other, and the quality of our hearts. And I'm a firm believer that if we're going to fix politics, if we're going to fix Washington, it's important that we start with our hearts. And that's why tonight I think it's so exciting and so important. And I'll get a little specific with Katie now about politics, but I thought at the introduction I'd talk with a little broader perspective. Katie?
Thanks, Al. So Al and I were next asked to comment on what our vision is for America. And I have to say, one thing was missing from the comments we heard at the beginning, and that was the story of women and the steady drumbeat of the last year, starting with the Women's March, and then nevertheless she persisted, hashtag Me Too, and hashtag Time's Up. Those gave way to young women gymnasts who confronted depraved Dr. Nasser in a women's judge's courtroom. Now 30,000 Democratic women are stepping up to run for office. We're in the midst of a feminist reckoning. So my vision for America is an egalitarian society. Everyone has access to affordable health care that includes prevention, and women have access to safe, effective reproductive health care, including birth control and abortion. Everyone values and has access to free, quality public education from pre-K through college. As in Finland, children are given what they need to learn, whether it's nutrition, counseling for their parents, tutoring when they need it, mental health care, transportation. No one is hungry or malnourished. All children are wanted and free from abuse and neglect. Everyone earns a living wage for their work and are given paid time off to care for newborns and the sick and dying members of their families. Men and women of every race, color, ethnicity, and sexual orientation or identity are paid equally for work of comparable value. Women make up 50% of our elected leadership, civic leadership, and businesses and institutions. Everyone has a clean, safe environment, parks and open spaces, healthy oceans, lakes and rivers, abundant natural resources that are shared by all, safe water to drink, and food that's free of contaminants and carcinogens. Animals used for human consumption are treated humanely while they're alive and then killed mercifully. People respect animals, eat them sparingly or not at all, and get nourishment more from plants. People think of themselves as citizens rather than consumers. That is, they want to contribute more to their communities and society and spend less time and money pursuing the latest gadget, convenience, or luxury item. People value their tribal identities, but seek to understand people from other tribes by intentionally going out of their way to interact and learn. Religion takes a back seat to moral and ethical behavior. Patriarchal religions evolve into egalitarian religions, valuing the leadership and equality of women. Our justice system becomes one where equal justice is a reality regardless of class, status, color, ethnicity, sex, sexual identity, immigration status, or ability to afford a lawyer. Corrections institutions correct. They do not abuse, torture, or kill people. Gun laws are restrictive and personal gun ownership becomes rare. All citizens participate in at least a year of public service between high school and college, whether it's the military, the Peace Corps, or some version of the Civil Conservation Corps that built our infrastructure during the FDR administration. All governments, from local to federal, practice good government, integrity, honesty, civility, responsiveness, good judgment, transparency, use of data, and science-based information. We welcome immigrants, especially refugees, and help integrate them into our society. People willingly and patriotically pay their fair share of taxes to benefit the Commonwealth and to make my utopian vision possible. Al, what's your vision for America?
Thank you, Katie. Oh, well, that's a pretty good list. Hard to disagree with a lot of what she's had to say. My vision for America is based on some basics that I think I learned along the way. One of those is the rule that if I list, in my heart list, every single thing I'd like to see done for America, the list cost would far exceed our government's ability to pay for it. After all, the way a country runs is, there's so much wealth that's generated by labor and production, and some of it the government keeps, and some of it the people keep, hopefully in their pockets. And so The goal is to do as much for the people as can be afforded to be done and keep the country's economy healthy so that there could be employment for most people and that more people can prosper within the confines of that. We now have a national debt in excess of $20 trillion. If today the interest rate was the same as it was during Bill Clinton's administration, more than half of the federal budget would go towards paying interest on the debt. And so there are a number of constraints that even the warmest hearted person have to be cognizant of, or our country will lose its way. And so, yes, there are, I think most of the basic things that Katie mentioned are something that we have a moral obligation to our fellow men and women. I think that there's got to be a threshold of poverty below which no American should live, and every American should have. But you know how much money we spend building roads, how many more hospitals we build, how many things we do as a country in the 12 investment categories that we have, the military, have a lot to do with that very delicate balance between not having our future generations saddled with what could be a financial apocalypse. And so, it's difficult. And it's heart-tearing at times trying to figure out what we can afford to do, knowing that the needs exceed our ability to pay for it. So having said all of that, no one does as much for its citizens as we do. We have a crisis that not many people really understand. We have a generation of Americans, my children, for example, who've decided they're going to have less children than I did and my parents did. And that's creating a smaller country in terms of its number of people, the labor force, our productivity. You look at places like Japan and other places where that's the case, and you see shrinking economies. The only way our country can survive is with a healthy migration. Migrants who come to America not only to taste and seek freedom, but with a hunger to do better for themselves and their families. And this is not just for the migrants who are truly deserving from a human rights standpoint. This is because without that labor force, our entitlement programs, Social Security, Medicare, Medicaid, they'd all collapse because you'd have far more people being recipients of the benefits than those paying into the benefits. Right now in America, if we go through the year 2025, most of our entitlement programs will go bankrupt because of the fact that we're going to have a smaller and smaller labor force. So immigration is critical to our survival. It's critical to show the kind of heart that we have. And I think Katie joins me in that, and that should not be a partisan issue. It should be a United States and for its benefit issue. And lastly, let me share this with you. I don't know where we're going politically. The political party process itself has transformed itself, and there's now more money in the private sector than in the political parties to participate in. I'm concerned about very few Americans having a preponderance of say on who our elected officials are, and that's not healthy for America or a democracy, and we have to fix that. The second thing we need to fix as a country is, we can't all be monolithic. The Democratic Party can't consist of people who believe only in one platform, set of facts and ours. I remember when I grew up, we had the Rockefeller Republicans in the Northeast and the Ford Republicans in the Midwest and the, Goldwater Republicans in the South. That era's gone. Same thing with the Democrats. We had healthy Democrats and participation in the South. That's pretty much done. It's primarily now in the coastal areas and the big cities. You go outside of those and you see very, very few Democrat representation. And so both parties are amiss in not reaching out to a wider audience. And as a result of that, both her party and my party have less people prescribed to it than we did before. We have a shrinking percentage of the population registered in the Democrat Party and an equal shrinking percentage in our party. The fastest growing party or the fastest growing voter population is a no party affiliation. And when they see what's going on in Washington, more and more voters are going to turn no party affiliation. And very soon, before you know it, those no party either our political parties fix themselves and people are willing to go back to where their proclivities may be. We may have a third party, or we may have coalitions like they do in Israel and elsewhere, where it's pretty hard to govern. But we're not going to stay the way we are politically if our elected officials behave towards each other the way they behave. Thanks.
You know, there are always proponents and opponents on any issue, but to be civil, we have to agree to disagree. And in a democratic society, we have to resolve contentious issues through the democratic process. But it has to be a clean, uncorrupted democratic process with a level playing field. And we can't tolerate intolerance. Your rights stop where my nose begins, or where my uterus begins, or when I have to use a public restroom, or when I want to buy a cake to celebrate a same-sex wedding. We all supposedly believe in the democratic system, one person, one vote. Can we agree that we shouldn't put up barriers to people exercising this fundamental right? We have early voting, voting by mail, and voting on election day. All these things are good. But there's no valid reason to restrict felons once they've done their time from participating in our democracy. The state with the highest number of disenfranchised voters is Florida, with 1.5 million. It's no coincidence that these are mostly black men. Last week, a judge ruled this practice unconstitutional, and it's going to be a ballot issue in November. There's no valid reason for allowing gerrymandering. Voting districts should not favor incumbents or either party. It's just another way to obstruct justice in voting, which delegitimizes our system. There's no valid reason to have the corruption of money in our elections and political system. Campaign finance reform is overdue, but campaign finance reform depends on a new Supreme Court. If we care about issues and our freedoms, it's not enough to try to convince those who have a different ideology. Elle and I have different ideologies, but we agree on many things. It's up to us, though, to recruit candidates who share our ideology and our values. Contribute time and money to campaigns. Organize your friends, your family, your neighborhood, your social networks. African-American feminist activist Florence Kennedy once said, "Don't agonize, organize." She also said that the biggest sin is sitting on your ass. And no, General Kelly, it's not the immigrants who are sitting on their asses.
Yeah.
Support your party so that it's healthy and strong enough to do its job of organizing, training, and getting the vote out. Because if we fight fair and we win, the result is legitimacy of our government. If we fight dirty and we win, people know that the system is rigged and legitimacy is questioned. But if we fight fair and are accused unfairly of having a rigged system, then we're lost, confused, cynical, and we become apathetic. Can we just agree on the fact that the end does not justify the means? Can we agree to call out those who are lying, manipulating, inciting fear, racism, and sexism? The compromise is just working hard for our beliefs and our values and then playing by the rules. Rules that are fair to all concerned. Can we agree on that?
We're going to agree on that.
Okay.
Thanks, Katie. Look, our founding fathers decided that our country couldn't work well without everyone having a seat at the table. That's why these arcane rules of the Senate, asking for 60 people to have a say before a final bill is passed, are important. We've had two major bills only passed in the last 8 years, and they are both very faulty. One was passed with only Democrat support, and that's the so-called Obamacare bill, whereas even Democrats today will tell you that it needs quite a bit of fixing. There's some of my party who want to get rid of it, but I think all of us can agree that at least there's some major fixes required. And then on my side, there's a tax reform bill that, in my opinion, gives people in America only 20% of the benefit and a few 80%. And that bill wouldn't look that way. I think overall, there's some aspects of the bill we needed. Corporate rates needed to be lower so that we can compete in this very competitive global economy, and hopefully everybody would benefit. But we increased our national debt by almost $1 trillion at a time when we shouldn't be doing that. And so if we had both parties at a table, I'm sure that bill would have been a lot better, and Middle America would have had a larger spread of the amounts saved. And so, that's both those items are living proof that, one, we don't pass enough important laws, and B, those we pass by strictly partisan, because the tax reform bill passed with only Republican support, and the health care bill passed with only Democrat support. That's not the way to do these things. There's a growing group of people in Congress, 48 of them, but half and half, Democrat and Republican, have gotten together and created a problem solvers caucus. I'm involved with Joe Lieberman and myself and Mac McClarty and quite a few Republicans in this group, No Labels. That's kind of the birthplace of the Problem Solvers Caucus, and it's getting bigger and bigger. Those are people who say, look, we need to have a seat at the table, because without our math, you're just not going to pass important stuff, but at least you get both points of view. So I think that's a good step towards problem solving. But politics should be all about the art of the possible. And starting out, both parties know that things are not going to pass unless certain bills, certain things are not going to pass unless everyone participates. And those who have more numbers should have more of a say. But at the end of the day, the real question for any legislator needs to be, I'm not going to agree. If I wrote this bill, it'd look different, but is this better than what we have now? And if you agree with that, then you ought to be a problem solver. And I think that's something that's gaining power in Washington as a result of the sickness over gridlock. But we have a lot of forces that are benefiting by the gridlock and by animosity, not the least of which, is the media. And, cable news is based on ratings, and ratings decipher earnings, and earnings are going pretty well the more aggressive and nasty they get. And that's going to be a hard one to break, because most Americans now have their favorite station, and that favorite station provides, I think, a point of view that's excessive, misguided, and helps create the animosity we have. A lot of problems. Katie cited the gerrymandering. That's a huge problem. The cable news networks are a big problem. The big money outside of politics is a big problem. But at the end of the day, the most significant issue we have to deal with is the quality of our hearts. And I'm glad that you had a good take of it tonight. Thanks for having us. Thank you.
Thanks, Al.
Thank you. Let's give him a nice round of applause. And now please welcome to the stage the Executive Director of the Immigration Partnership and Coalition Fund, Ms. Wendy Adelson. And joining her on stage, the District Director and Deputy Chief of Staff of Congressman Carlos Curbelo, Mr. Chris Miles.
Thank you, George. I am so proud to be here tonight. As George mentioned, my name is Wendy Adelson, and I lead the Impact Fund, which is a coalition of business and civic leaders founded last year by Mike Fernandez, who's a prominent businessman in our town with a very big heart and a lot of feeling for this issue of immigration. We are united in seeking sensible and humane immigration reform. Our work is bipartisan and solution-focused. And through our work together, I got the chance to meet Chris Miles, the lovely and talented Chris Miles.
I'm the lovely and talented Chris Miles. And I work as the Congressman's District Director, running his offices here in Florida. And I get to work every day in a bipartisan manner on issues like immigration, climate change, and really just working to try to change the tone in politics. And I've been able to do some great stuff with Wendy, and I'm very excited to be here.
So full disclosure, my parents are Democrats. Some of my best friends are Democrats. I actually didn't meet my first Republican until I went to law school. But now party affiliation feels far less important to me than the values that we share across party lines. Chris and I are both actively involved in the pursuit of a legislative solution for DACA, for deferred action for childhood arrivals, for young people, sometimes babies brought to this country, who've grown up here, growing up as American, and thought this country was their home and their present and their future. In my role with IMPAC, our partners in passing legislation are the reasonable middle, like Chris and his team, whether they're Republicans or Democrats, not the loud and often extreme voices at the margins of either party. This is a time when we need thoughtful dialogue. We need a willingness to listen and to compromise for the greater good, like the Dreamers. Dogged adherence to a party line is not going to move us forward as a community, a country, or a society.
For me, growing up in Miami with Cuban grandparents, you know, when I met my first Republican, it was when I was born. But another thing that surrounded my childhood, being the grandson of exiles, was this idea that politics and government were extremely important. That and education were the two most important things. And it was something that was very central to my childhood, whether we were at Coffee Window or La Ventanita at Versailles or Islas Canarias later on when we moved out west, like most Cuban families did. This one theme of democracy being so important was just always reiterated. And part of what I was taught was that the United States was different because, unlike other countries, we didn't submit to authoritarian strongmen. We believed in our institutions, the separation of powers, the idea of every vote counts, equality, fairness. And through the last election cycle, a lot of that got rattled, whether it was some of the clips we saw up there, the fake news, the media being discredited, institutions that had been so central to my upbringing being challenged by both parties. And it was really kind of a scary thought. But however, working with Wendy, on this issue, which is so important, DACA, I have a renewed sense, in the shadow of this very divisive election, I have a new sense of optimism, which comes from what her fund does and what so many other leaders and most of us here believe in, that these young children deserve an opportunity to stay in this country because they are Americans. And recognizing that has helped inspire me and kind of refresh me a little bit. So that video was scary, but I do think we have a good path forward.
Our friends and colleagues tonight presented many different perspectives on the lives they have lived here in Miami and in other parts of the United States, on their values and their hopes for the future of our community and for our country. They talked about what it means to be American, to embrace the rule of law, the freedom of the press, the freedom to dissent, economic opportunity and social mobility, and respectful debate and compromise. There is some disagreement amongst the speakers about how threatened those values are in our current discourse.
But there's no disagreement that these are America's values. The conversation finds common elements in this very diverse backgrounds and histories of these individuals, including values that are passed down by our parents, grandparents, and other family experiences. Moments of discovery about difference, injustice, decisions made to direct one's life and work toward building of community, appreciation of the freedoms offered in the United States, and a feeling of responsibility to use those freedoms in a constructive way.
We are facing real challenges as a city and as a community. Tonight we have come together to acknowledge that this is not an easy moment. There are no simple fixes. But instead, this is a time to reach across lines of difference, whether they be political, racial, religious, gender-based, or otherwise, and embrace our commonalities, to search for what unites us instead of what divides.
The strength of our democracy is in this room. No elected leader, political party, cable news show, or interest group can undermine the will of our people and the institutions that make up our democracy. It's time to turn down the noise of partisanship and identity politics and turn to the principles that unite us all. Democracy lives in us.
That was great, wasn't it? So you see, there you have it, folks. Democracy does in fact live in Miami. The night is getting long, and I could reflect on many things that I heard and the kinds of reactions that I saw people have. But I just want to say one thing, that when we first started talking about this, when we first started rehearsing, these 5 folks that did that first group monologue didn't know each other, and by the end of it, it was really amazing to see how engaged they were, and it really made me proud to see that kind of interaction. And so I congratulate all of them, everyone on stage, for being here tonight. This is a small crowd of people compared to the rest of the people that need this kind of inspiration and guidance on what to do. And it's inspiring leaders like this that will help folks peel away from the drama and move forward towards productive action. It's also that kind of leadership provided by those that made this night possible through their generous financial support. The Knight Foundation, one email to Alberto and he got it right away. The Green Family Foundation, thank you, Kimberly, Ambassador, and Dorothea, for your belief in me and this idea so early on. Thank you. The Miami Foundation for having their pulse on all of the current needs of our communities. And leaders like Steve Zack and the Zack Family Foundation, John Kislak, Cesar Alvarez, Carlos Saladrigas, former Mayor Alex Pinellas, all of them for their contributions. Thank you so very much. And of course, there are the local heroes and sheroes that you find listed in the program, whose intellectual, in very small print, I might add, sorry about that, but whose intellectual, political, and emotional support was key to getting here. It's been a really long, somewhat organic journey. Early in November of last year, a Republican friend of mine who had not heard her for quite some time, who was concerned with what he was seeing and hearing, called me and said, "This democracy is under attack. You know it, I know it. What are you going to do about it?" I was like, what am I going to do about it? What the heck I don't know what I'm going to do about it. What are you going to do about it? What the heck is anybody going to do about it? Well, look around you tonight. Tonight reflects one thing we can do and did do. Thanks to many of you, we are here tonight, over a year later, to show ourselves, this community, and maybe the country, that in spite of everything going on, democracy indeed lives in Miami and remains alive and well in this country. But how much can we really accomplish in one night? Potentially nothing, and possibly a lot. It all depends on you. It all depends on us. It's our hope that leaders in this room will leave here today saying, it actually depends on me. As usually is the case, though, before we know where we are going, it's helpful to know where we came from. And if we're honest, we know that the current degenerative public discourse that's currently threatening our way of life is not the product of any one elected official, but rather a symptom of a slow and gradual malady that has been incrementally infecting our democracy for decades. Some say that the decline of trust and civility in our political landscape can be traced to Watergate or the social upheavals of the 60s. Some even point their fingers to the rising cable TV news and social media. Whatever the origins, it feels as if we may have reached a tipping point with the future health of our democracy in the balance. It would be a mistake to believe that the intense polarization we experience today is simply about immigration or reproductive rights, race, or any other policy or point of view. Political disagreement is natural and inevitable. But what we're experiencing now is something more. Our democratic values and institutions that protect them are being undermined. Independent courts are being questioned and even mocked. Our rule of law is attacked by those that ignore rulings they disagree with. Our cherished free press is disparaged so harshly that journalists are put in physical danger. The press, often under pressure from corporate interests for ratings and financial returns, can be complicit in escalating that noise, making it difficult to discern the line between fact and political hyperbole. Let's be clear. Attacks on the values and institutional protections that safeguard our freedoms are neither liberal nor conservative. They are un-American. Our ability as Americans to differentiate between policy, ideology, and values is vital to a healthy democracy. I mean, we can support widely different policy solutions to our challenges. And we understand that people espouse different ideologies depending on how they see fundamentally how to govern. But it's our commitment to these American values that provide the framework for the health and vitality of our civic infrastructure. So how do we survive these anxiety-ridden times? Well, we take a moment to take stock and realign ourselves with these shared values. Our history is marked by moments when Americans took stock and took action on behalf of democratic institutions. I mean, that's how we decided that 8-year-olds shouldn't be working 10 hours in dingy factories, right? It's how we came together from all sides to ultimately defeat McCarthyism. It's how we tapped our sense of justice when we stood up to ensure voting rights regardless of gender and race. While the past has taught us invaluable lessons about securing our freedoms, it is now our task to ensure democracy in the future. Regardless of our identities and political affiliations, we must find common ground in resisting those that seek to attack, diminish, and dismantle our democratic institutions. Thank you. Don't let anyone dismiss this call for genuine public discourse as a faint effort to be polite or politically correct. It's not. We have to begin with the premise that our political opponents love this country too. I mean, simply put, if I vehemently disagree with you on an array of issues, but I know that we share a love for this country, I'm going to be a better listener. And you're going to be a better listener. And we both will be more curious about what shapes each other's convictions. And as a result, our conversation is less likely to disintegrate to name-calling, shaming, and will likely produce more vibrant debates and more equitable solutions. So what's our next step? Remembering what we heard here tonight and leveraging the power of shared values to realign ourselves accordingly. And, you know, please give a robust round of applause to Joel, Peter, Eddie, Maru, Max, James, Mike, and everyone in the Democracy Lives in Miami team. Thank you. We need them as we need you for our next goal, and that's the Democracy Lives in Miami Fall Conference, which is now scheduled for September 27th this year at Miami-Dade College. And there we're going to have an opportunity to take a deeper dive on these issues and attempt to move forward for a more perfect union. And I just want to close by, first of all, thanking you all for being here. I know this was an event with no organization and people were like, what is this and who is this and what is this? But something triggered you, right? Something piqued your interest, something that you've been feeling. And I just want to say that if there was not one thing that somebody said here that made you kind of eek or made you uncomfortable, then we probably didn't do our job. I hope it did. Good. And when you leave here, because we've all been in places where we feel great and then we go and life takes advantage. But we're going to work towards this conference together, and we want your opinion. We want to, this is the beginning. This event does not solve anything. It simply acknowledges where we're at. So when you're watching TV a couple of months from now, and you're looking at that parade going down Pennsylvania Avenue with tanks, I want you to remember today, and I want you to take some action in your leadership sphere to make sure that our democracy survives. Thank you so much.